The clinking of plates and the hum of chatter filled the small diner where Claire spent most of her days. At just 14, she had grown used to the rhythm of the place, the sizzling of burgers on the grill, the scrape of forks on plates, and the occasional burst of laughter from happy customers. For Claire, the diner wasn't just a job. It was survival. Her hands moved swiftly as she cleared a table, her worn sneakers squeaking softly on the linoleum floor. Her boss, Mr. Douglas, owned the place, but it was his son, Brandon, who ruled it with an iron fist. Brandon was everything Claire wasn't: privileged, arrogant, and hungry for power. He barely lifted a finger but acted as though the entire operation depended on him. "Claire!" Brandon's sharp voice cut through the din. She flinched but turned toward him, a forced smile on her face. "You missed a spot," he sneered, pointing to an invisible crumb on the table she had just cleaned. "I'll get it," she said softly, gripping her rag tightly. She bent over to clean the table again, her cheeks burning with embarrassment as Brandon smirked at her expense. It was always like this, Brandon finding reasons to humiliate her, especially when others were watching. As the lunch rush ended and the diner emptied, Claire took a moment to catch her breath by the back door. The faint smell of grease and the distant hum of traffic were her only companions. She couldn't complain, complaining wasn't an option. Her foster mother, Nancy, had made it clear, if Claire didn't pull her weight, she'd be out on the streets. For Claire, every dollar she earned was a step toward a future she could call her own. But Brandon had other plans. Later that afternoon, as the diner began to fill again, Brandon stormed out of the office, his face twisted in feigned outrage. "Where is she?" he demanded, his voice loud enough to silence the small crowd of customers. Claire froze mid-step, her heart pounding. "What's wrong?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Brandon held up a $20 bill. "This was missing from the register." "I know you took it, Claire." The room went deathly quiet. Claire's throat went dry as she shook her head. "I didn't take anything," she said firmly, her voice trembling. She glanced at Mr. Douglas, hoping for support, but he only frowned at her with suspicion. "Don't lie," Brandon snapped. "I saw you near the register earlier. You think I don't notice?" Claire's face turned pale. She had been near the register to bring a receipt to a customer, but she hadn't taken anything. "Check the cameras," she said desperately, but Brandon smirked, knowing full well the cameras hadn't been working for weeks. "You're done here," Mr. Douglas said, his tone cold. "Pack up your things and leave." The humiliation hit her like a tidal wave. Customers whispered among themselves, some shaking their heads while others glanced at her with pity. Claire felt the sting of tears but refused to cry. She turned and walked to the back to grab her belongings, each step heavier than the last. Claire walked home in a daze, her feet dragging along the cracked pavement. The chill of the late afternoon wind bit at her skin, but it was nothing compared to the cold knot in her chest. Her mind raced with questions she couldn't answer. Why had Brandon done this? Why hadn't Mr. Douglas believed her? And what was she supposed to do now? The small house she shared with her foster family came into view, its peeling paint and sagging porch a reflection of the life inside. Claire hesitated at the door, her hand hovering over the handle. She didn't want to go in, not like this. But she had no choice. Taking a deep breath, she stepped inside. Nancy, her foster mother, was in the kitchen, smoking a cigarette and flipping through a magazine. She barely looked up as Claire entered. "What are you doing home so early?" Nancy asked, her voice sharp and uninterested. Claire swallowed hard. I lost my job." Nancy's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing. "What do you mean, you lost your job? You're the only one who brings money into this house." "It wasn't my fault," Claire said quickly. "Brandon accused me of stealing, but I didn't do it. I swear." "Don't you dare start lying to me, girl," Nancy interrupted, slamming the magazine down on the counter. "Do you know how hard it is to keep you here? To feed you? And now you want me to believe you were fired for no reason?" Claire opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. She knew Nancy wouldn't listen. She never did. "I'm done," Nancy said, throwing her hands up. "You're nothing but trouble. Pack your things and get out. I can't have a thief under my roof." "Please, I didn't do anything wrong," Claire pleaded, her voice breaking. "I'll find another job. Just give me a chance. Out!" Nancy barked, pointing toward the door. "And don't come back." Claire stared at her foster mother, the woman who had taken her in years ago but never truly cared for her. She wanted to scream, to fight, to make Nancy understand, but she knew it was useless. With tears streaming down her face, she turned and ran to her small room. The space was barely more than a closet, with a single bed and a stack of crates serving as a makeshift dresser. She grabbed her backpack and shoved in what little she owned, a few changes of clothes, an old notebook, and a photograph of her real parents, worn and faded from years of handling. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. By the time she stepped back into the living room, Nancy was leaning against the counter, her arms crossed. "Don't think you're coming back here," she said coldly as Claire walked past her. Claire didn't respond. She opened the door and stepped out into the growing darkness, the weight of Nancy's words pressing down on her. For the first time in her life, she was completely alone. The streets were quiet as Claire wandered aimlessly, clutching her backpack like a lifeline. The evening air grew colder, and the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of purple and gray. She passed houses with warm lights glowing in the windows, families sitting down to dinner or watching TV together. The sight only made the ache in her chest grow stronger. She didn't know where to go. The few friends she had were kids from school, and she couldn't bring herself to show up at their doors, not like this. The shelters she had heard about were miles away, and she didn't have the bus fare to reach them. So she kept walking, hoping the movement would keep her warm and distract her from the gnawing fear growing inside her. Hours passed, and her legs grew heavy. She found herself in an alley behind a row of stores, the scent of garbage and grease thick in the air. It wasn't safe, but she was too tired to care. She sank down against the wall, pulling her knees to her chest and wrapping her arms around herself for warmth. The night was long and restless. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the distant wail of a siren, the occasional footsteps of a stranger, sent her heart racing. Sleep came in short, fitful bursts, and when morning finally arrived, Claire felt as though she hadn't slept at all. The first rays of sunlight brought little comfort. Her stomach growled, and her limbs felt stiff from the cold. She stood and stretched, wincing as her muscles protested. She had to keep moving, had to find something, anything, to get through the day. She wandered into a nearby park, where the grass sparkled with dew and birds chirped in the trees. It was peaceful, almost serene, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside her. Claire sat on a bench, her backpack at her feet, and stared at the ground. She didn't know how long she could keep going like this, but she didn't have a choice. As the morning wore on, the park began to fill with joggers and dog walkers. Claire kept her head down, hoping no one would notice her. But deep down, she wished someone would, a kind stranger, a friend, anyone who might see her and offer help. But no one did. The hours stretched on, and Claire's hunger grew unbearable. She considered searching for food in the trash cans, but couldn't bring herself to do it. Not yet. She still had a shred of pride left, and she clung to it desperately. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Claire made a decision. She didn't know what the future held or how she would survive, but she wouldn't give up. Not yet. She had faced worse before, and she would face this too. All she needed was a chance, just one chance, to prove she was stronger than the circumstances trying to break her. With renewed determination, she picked up her backpack and walked out of the park, ready to face whatever the day might bring. The next few days blurred into one long stretch of survival. Claire moved through the city with no destination, no plan, just the sheer will to keep going. She learned quickly that the streets were unforgiving. The world didn't stop for a girl like her, and it didn't offer mercy. If she wanted to survive, she had to find a way. Her first challenge was hunger. The small amount of money she had brought from her last paycheck was gone after a single meal from a convenience store. With nothing left, she was forced to get creative. Claire began collecting discarded bottles and cans from trash bins and alleyways, trading them at recycling centers for a few dollars. It wasn't much, but it was enough for a piece of bread or a banana to keep her going. At night, she searched for safe places to sleep. She found an overhang behind a library where the ground was dry and the walls provided some shelter from the wind. It wasn't comfortable, but it was quiet, and the library staff didn't seem to mind when she lingered on the benches nearby during the day. Claire would often sit there with her notebook, scribbling drawings or writing down her thoughts. It was the only piece of her old life she had left, and it gave her a fragile sense of stability. One afternoon, as she roamed the streets in search of recyclables, Claire saw an elderly woman struggling with a heavy bag of groceries. The woman's face was pinched with effort, and her steps were unsteady. Without thinking, Claire rushed to her side. "Let me help you," she said, reaching for the bag. The woman hesitated, her eyes narrowing slightly as she looked at Claire's worn clothes and tired face. But then she nodded, handing over the bag with a small sigh of relief. "Thank you, dear," the woman said as Claire walked alongside her. "My house is just around the corner." Claire carried the bag without complaint, though her arms ached from the weight. When they reached the woman's modest home, she set the bag on the porch and turned to leave. "Wait," the woman called, opening her purse. "Take this." She held out a crumpled $5 bill. Claire shook her head, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "I can't take that," she said. "I just wanted to help." "Nonsense," the woman insisted, pressing the bill into Claire's hand. "You've got a good heart, child. The world needs more people like you." Claire mumbled a quiet thank you and walked away, the money clutched tightly in her hand. The woman's words echoed in her mind, warming her in a way that the money never could. For the first time in days, she felt like someone saw her, not as a homeless girl, but as a person. The small victories gave Claire strength, but the struggles never stopped. One evening, as she walked through a park collecting cans, a group of teenagers spotted her. They were older than her, dressed in expensive clothes that screamed privilege. Claire kept her head down, hoping they would ignore her, but their laughter cut through the air like knives. "Hey, scavenger," one of them called. "Looking for dinner in the trash?" Claire's cheeks burned, but she didn't respond. She quickened her pace, clutching her backpack tightly. "Don't ignore us," another said, stepping in front of her. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a cruel grin. "We're just trying to help. You want a handout?" The group laughed as he pulled a crumpled candy wrapper from his pocket and threw it at her feet. Claire's heart raced, but she forced herself to keep walking, her hands trembling as she gripped the straps of her bag. They didn't follow her, but the humiliation lingered long after they were gone. Claire ducked into an alley and leaned against the wall, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. She wiped at her eyes, furious with herself for letting them get to her. "I won't let them break me," she whispered to herself, her voice shaking. "I won't." As the days turned into weeks, Claire's resolve only grew stronger. She began to learn the rhythms of the city, the best times to visit recycling centers, the safest places to sleep, and the kind of people she could trust. She avoided large crowds and stuck to quiet areas where she could go unnoticed. It wasn't much of a life, but it was hers, and she clung to it with everything she had. One morning, as she sat on a bench in the park sketching in her notebook, she noticed a man sitting nearby. He was well-dressed but not flashy, with a leather briefcase resting at his feet. He seemed distracted, his gaze fixed on the path ahead as if lost in thought. Claire returned to her sketch, but out of the corner of her eye, she saw the man stand and walk away, leaving his briefcase behind. She frowned, glancing around to see if he would come back, but he didn't. The briefcase sat there, untouched. Her first instinct was to leave it alone. It wasn't her business, and she didn't want to draw attention to herself. But then she thought about how she would feel if she lost something important. With a sigh, she picked up the briefcase and hurried after the man. "Excuse me," she called, her voice carrying through the park. The man turned, his face lighting up with relief when he saw her holding the briefcase. "Oh, thank you," he said, taking it from her. "I didn't even realize I left it behind." Claire shrugged. "It's no big deal." "It is to me," he said, his eyes softening as he looked at her. "Not many people would go out of their way to help a stranger." Claire smiled faintly, not knowing what to say. The man hesitated for a moment, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. "If you ever need anything," he said, handing it to her, "don't hesitate to call." Claire nodded, tucking the card into her pocket. As the man walked away, she didn't think much of the encounter. She had done what anyone would have done, or at least, what she hoped they would. What she didn't know was that this moment would change everything. Claire didn't think much about the man or the business card as she slipped it into her pocket. She had no use for connections, let alone a way to follow up with someone who clearly lived in a world far removed from hers. Her focus remained on survival, getting through each day, finding food, and staying out of harm's way. But the encounter lingered in her mind, an unshakable curiosity about the stranger who seemed so grateful for her simple act of kindness. The man, Alexander Stone, sat in his high-rise office later that evening, reviewing contracts while sipping his coffee. His mind, however, kept drifting to the girl in the park. Her clothes were worn, and her face carried the weight of exhaustion, yet her honesty and determination to return his briefcase struck a chord. There was something about her, an air of quiet strength that reminded him of his own struggles long before he built his empire. Alexander wasn't the kind of man to let questions linger. He had spent his life solving problems, dissecting situations, and ensuring every detail was accounted for. The more he thought about the girl, the more he wanted to understand her story. He called his assistant. "Find out what you can about the girl who returned my briefcase this morning," he instructed. "I want to know everything." Claire's life continued much as it had in the weeks since she was thrown out of her foster home. She spent her days wandering the city and her nights curled up in her makeshift shelter behind the library. The occasional moments of kindness from strangers kept her spirits afloat, but the loneliness gnawed at her. She missed having someone to talk to, someone who cared about her well-being. One afternoon, as she sat on a park bench sketching in her notebook, a familiar voice startled her. "Hello again." She looked up to see Alexander standing a few feet away, his hands in his pockets and a warm smile on his face. He wasn't wearing the suit he had on the last time she saw him. Instead, he wore a casual sweater and jeans, blending in with the parkgoers around him. "Hi," she said hesitantly, closing her notebook. "I didn't expect to see you again." "I wanted to thank you properly," he said, sitting down on the bench beside her. "I never got your name." "Claire," she said, her voice guarded. "Claire," he repeated, nodding. "I'm Alexander. And I owe you one." "You don't owe me anything," she replied quickly. "I just did what anyone would have done." "Not everyone would have gone out of their way to help a stranger," Alexander said, studying her closely. "And not everyone would have been as honest as you were." Claire shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what to make of his attention. She didn't trust people easily, especially those who seemed to have everything she didn't. But there was something disarming about Alexander, something that made her want to believe he wasn't like the others. Alexander spent the next hour talking to Claire, carefully steering the conversation to learn more about her without prying too deeply. He discovered bits and pieces of her life, how she had been kicked out of her foster home, how she was surviving on the streets, and how she refused to give up despite everything she'd been through. The more he listened, the more he admired her resilience. Claire, in turn, found herself lowering her guard. Alexander didn't treat her with pity or condescension. He seemed genuinely interested in her story, and for the first time in weeks, she felt seen. As the conversation wound down, Alexander reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I know you don't want charity," he said, his tone gentle. "But this isn't charity, it's an opportunity. There's a community center downtown that helps people in tough situations. They have resources for education, job training, and even housing. If you ever want to check it out, I think it could really help." Claire hesitated, staring at the paper in his hand. She wanted to refuse, to prove that she could make it on her own. But deep down, she knew she couldn't keep living like this forever. She took the paper, her fingers brushing against the edges as if it might disappear at any moment. "Thank you," she said softly, tucking it into her pocket. Alexander smiled. "It's the least I can do. You deserve a fair shot, Claire. And if you ever need anything, you know how to reach me." He stood and gave her one last nod before walking away, leaving Claire alone on the bench with the folded paper clutched in her hand. She opened it and read the address, her heart pounding with a mix of hope and fear. That evening, Claire made her way to the address Alexander had given her. The community center was a modest building tucked away on a quiet street, its windows glowing warmly in the fading light. She hesitated at the door, her stomach twisting with nerves. Part of her wanted to turn around and walk away, but the other part, the part that had kept her going all these weeks, urged her forward. Inside, the center was bustling with activity. Volunteers moved between tables, handing out food and clothing, while others sat with people in quiet conversations. A woman at the front desk greeted Claire with a kind smile. "Welcome," the woman said. "How can we help you?" Claire swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm not sure. I just need help." The woman nodded, her smile never wavering. "You've come to the right place. Let's start with getting you something to eat, and then we can talk about the rest." For the first time in weeks, Claire felt a glimmer of hope. The community center wasn't just a place to get a meal, it was a lifeline. She met with a counselor who talked to her about her goals and the resources available to her. She learned about programs that could help her finish school, find a job, and even secure a place to live. As she sat in a quiet corner of the center, sipping a cup of warm tea, Claire realized that her chance encounter with Alexander had been more than luck. It had been a turning point, a moment that shifted the course of her life. But she also knew this was only the beginning. The road ahead would be long and uncertain, and she would have to fight for every step forward. Yet for the first time in what felt like forever, she believed she could do it. The community center became Claire's sanctuary over the next few weeks. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. She spent her days attending workshops on job training and basic financial literacy, while her evenings were dedicated to quiet reflection in the small room they provided for her. It was a stark contrast to the cold and uncertainty of the streets, and Claire found herself slowly easing into this new rhythm. One afternoon, as she sat in the center's library reading a book on budgeting, she heard a familiar voice behind her. "How's it going, Claire?" She turned to see Alexander standing in the doorway, a warm smile on his face. Dressed in a tailored coat and scarf, he looked every bit the successful businessman, but his demeanor was as approachable as ever. "Alexander," she said, standing up. "I didn't expect to see you here." "I wanted to check in," he replied, walking toward her. "The center told me you've been making great progress. I hope it's been helpful." "It has," Claire admitted, though her tone was cautious. "I don't know where I'd be without it." Alexander nodded, pulling out a chair and sitting across from her. "I'm glad to hear that. But I know it's not just the center, you've done the hard part. You're the one who's shown up every day, putting in the effort." Claire blushed at the praise, unsure how to respond. She had always been used to criticism or indifference, not encouragement. It felt strange, but also oddly comforting. Over the next hour, they talked about everything from the workshops she was attending to the future she wanted to build for herself. Alexander listened intently, his questions thoughtful and his advice practical. He never made her feel small or inadequate, and for the first time, Claire felt like someone believed in her potential. As their conversation drew to a close, Alexander leaned forward, his expression serious. "Claire, I want to help you in a bigger way," he said. "But I need you to trust me." Her brows furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean?" "I've looked into your situation," he admitted gently. "I know what happened at the diner, and I know about Brandon. What he did to you was wrong, and it needs to be made right." Claire's stomach tightened at the mention of Brandon. The humiliation of that day was still fresh in her mind, and the idea of confronting it again made her want to retreat. She shook her head, her voice trembling. "I don't want to go back there," she said. "I just want to move on." Alexander reached across the table, his gaze steady and reassuring. "I understand that, Claire. But sometimes, moving forward means facing the past. If you let this go, Brandon will keep doing what he did to you, to others, too. You have the strength to stand up to him. And you won't have to do it alone." His words hung in the air, and for a long moment, Claire didn't respond. She wanted to believe him, to believe that she was capable of standing up for herself. But the fear of failure loomed large, threatening to crush the fragile hope she had begun to build. Finally, she nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do you need me to do?" Over the next few days, Alexander laid out his plan. He explained that he had gathered evidence to expose Brandon's lies and clear Claire's name. It wasn't just about justice, it was about giving Claire the chance to reclaim her dignity and prove to herself that she was stronger than the circumstances that had tried to break her. Claire spent hours working with Alexander and his team, recounting the events at the diner and helping them piece together the story. It was emotionally draining, but with each step, she felt a little lighter. For the first time, she wasn't carrying the burden alone. Alexander also encouraged her to continue her work at the community center, reminding her that this fight was just one part of her journey. He knew that building her confidence and independence was just as important as confronting her past. One evening, after a particularly long day of preparation, Alexander invited Claire to his office. It was a sleek, modern space with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking view of the city skyline. Claire felt out of place in such a luxurious environment, but Alexander's easygoing demeanor helped put her at ease. "I thought you might like to see where I work," he said, handing her a cup of hot chocolate. "You've earned a little break." Claire sipped the drink, her eyes wandering over the framed photographs and awards lining the walls. One photo in particular caught her attention, a younger Alexander standing in front of a small, run-down building with a group of smiling children. "Is that you?" she asked, pointing to the picture. Alexander chuckled. "It is. That's where I grew up, a small town in the middle of nowhere. We didn't have much, but we had each other." Claire looked at him, her curiosity piqued. "How did you go from that to this?" "It wasn't easy," he admitted. "There were a lot of late nights, setbacks, and moments when I wanted to give up. But I had people who believed in me, who gave me chances I didn't think I deserved. That's why I do what I do now, to pay it forward." His words resonated deeply with Claire. For the first time, she began to see Alexander not as an untouchable figure of success, but as someone who had once faced struggles of his own. It gave her hope that maybe, just maybe, she could overcome her own challenges too. As the evening wore on, Claire found herself opening up more than she ever had before. She told Alexander about her dreams of becoming an artist, how she used to draw for hours before life got in the way. He listened with genuine interest, encouraging her to pursue her passion. "Don't let the world tell you who you are, Claire," he said. "You get to decide that." Those words stayed with her long after she left his office that night. They became a mantra, a reminder that her life was still hers to shape. Claire didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she believed it could be something worth fighting for. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of preparation. Alexander's team worked tirelessly to build a case against Brandon and clear Claire's name. Claire spent hours recounting every detail of what had happened at the diner, the humiliation she endured, and the fallout that followed. It was exhausting and emotionally taxing, but with Alexander's steady guidance, she pressed forward. The plan was simple but bold: confront Brandon and Mr. Douglas with irrefutable evidence of their wrongdoing. Alexander had a network of investigators who unearthed financial records and employee testimonies revealing a pattern of misconduct at the diner, orchestrated largely by Brandon. Alexander wasn't just seeking justice for Claire, he was exposing a deeper corruption. One rainy afternoon, Claire sat across from Alexander in his office, a file folder spread open between them. The documents inside detailed Brandon's fraudulent behavior, including evidence that he had embezzled money from the diner and falsified accusations against other employees in the past. "Are you ready for this?" Alexander asked, studying her closely. His voice was calm, but there was a weight behind his words. Claire took a deep breath, her fingers gripping the edge of her chair. "I think so. It's scary, but I want to do this. I need to do this." Alexander nodded, his expression one of quiet pride. "You're stronger than you know, Claire. And no matter what happens, I'll be right there with you." The confrontation was scheduled to take place at a public town meeting. Alexander had orchestrated the event, ensuring that local officials, community members, and even reporters would be present. The goal was to make it impossible for Brandon and Mr. Douglas to deny the truth once it was laid bare. On the day of the meeting, Claire felt a mix of nerves and determination. She dressed in clean, modest clothes, a pair of jeans and a sweater provided by the community center, and carried herself with as much confidence as she could muster. Alexander met her outside the venue, his reassuring presence giving her the courage to step inside. The room buzzed with chatter as people filled the seats, curious about the unexpected event. Claire spotted Brandon near the front, lounging arrogantly in his chair, oblivious to what was coming. Mr. Douglas sat beside him, his face a mask of mild irritation. They hadn't yet noticed Claire or Alexander. The meeting began with a general introduction by a local council member, but the atmosphere shifted when Alexander stood and addressed the room. His voice was calm but commanding, and the weight of his presence silenced the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for gathering here today," he began. "I'm here to shed light on a situation that has affected one of your own, a young woman who was wrongfully accused, humiliated, and cast out because of the actions of others." He gestured toward Claire, who stood at his side, her heart pounding. "This is Claire, and today, she's here to tell her story." All eyes turned to Claire. Her palms were slick with sweat, but she swallowed her fear and stepped forward. The weight of the room bore down on her, but Alexander's voice echoed in her mind, "Don't let the world tell you who you are. You get to decide that." Taking a deep breath, she began. "I worked at the diner for 2 years," she said, her voice trembling but steady. "I gave everything I had to that job. But one day, I was accused of stealing money from the register, something I didn't do." She glanced at Brandon, whose smirk faltered slightly under the scrutiny of the crowd. "I was humiliated in front of everyone," Claire continued. "I lost my job, my home, and any chance I had at a stable life. And all because Brandon Douglas lied." The room erupted into murmurs, but Alexander held up a hand, quieting the crowd. He opened the folder he had brought with him and began presenting the evidence, records of Brandon's embezzlement, testimonies from former employees who had been similarly mistreated, and statements from customers who had witnessed his behavior. As the evidence mounted, Brandon's confidence crumbled. His face turned pale, and he shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Mr. Douglas tried to interject, but Alexander silenced him with a pointed look. "There's more," Alexander said, pulling out a final document. "This is a statement from the security company that serviced the diner's cameras. It confirms that Brandon deliberately disabled the cameras the week Claire was accused. He created a situation where no one could verify his story, because he knew it wasn't true." Gasps rippled through the room. Brandon shot to his feet, his face red with anger. "This is ridiculous," he shouted. "You have no proof." Alexander raised an eyebrow, unflinching. "You've just heard the proof, Mr. Douglas. The question now is what you plan to do about it." The council members conferred briefly before addressing the crowd. They announced that an investigation would be launched into the diner's practices, and Mr. Douglas would be held accountable for the actions of his son. Brandon's protests grew louder, but they were drowned out by the murmurs of the audience, who were already turning on him. Claire stood silently through it all, her heart pounding as she processed what was happening. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, but now that it was here, it felt surreal. As the meeting adjourned, Alexander placed a hand on her shoulder. "You did it," he said, his voice filled with pride. You stood up for yourself, and for everyone else Brandon hurt. Claire nodded, tears welling in her eyes. I couldn't have done it without you. You had it in you all along, Alexander replied. I just gave you the space to see it. As they left the venue, Claire felt a weight lift from her shoulders. For the first time in months, she felt free. The fight wasn't over, there would still be challenges ahead, but she had taken the first step toward reclaiming her life. That night, as she sat in her small room at the community center, she opened her notebook and began to draw. The lines flowed effortlessly, each stroke a reflection of the hope that now filled her heart. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living. The aftermath of the public meeting was a whirlwind. News of Brandon's actions and the corruption at the diner spread quickly through the town. Local newspapers ran stories highlighting Claire's courage in standing up against injustice, painting her as a symbol of resilience. But while many applauded her bravery, not everyone was on her side. Mr. Douglas and Brandon remained defiant. The diner temporarily closed for investigation, but they publicly denied all wrongdoing, claiming Claire had fabricated the accusations with Alexander's help. Brandon, in particular, took to social media to air his grievances, painting himself as the victim of a smear campaign. Claire tried not to let the negativity get to her, but it was hard. The scars of her humiliation still lingered, and the harsh words of strangers cut deep. Yet, every time doubt began to creep in, Alexander was there to remind her of her strength. A week after the meeting, Alexander called Claire into his office for an update. The investigation into the diner is moving forward, he said, handing her a stack of papers. They've found enough evidence to press charges against Brandon for embezzlement and falsifying records. As for Mr. Douglas, he'll likely lose his business license. Claire nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she flipped through the documents. It felt surreal to see her abusers finally being held accountable. But there's one more thing, Alexander continued, his tone more serious. Mr. Douglas has agreed to a mediation meeting. He wants to resolve things quietly, without more public fallout. Mediation? Claire asked, frowning. What does that mean? It means sitting in a room with them and negotiating some form of resolution, Alexander explained. They'll likely offer you a settlement in exchange for dropping any further claims. Claire's stomach churned at the thought of facing Brandon and his father again. The idea of sitting across from them, listening to their excuses, made her skin crawl. But Alexander's voice pulled her back. This is your decision, Claire, he said gently. You don't have to do anything you're not ready for. But if you choose to go, I'll be right there with you. The mediation was scheduled for the following week. Claire spent the days leading up to it preparing herself mentally, replaying every possible scenario in her mind. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she also knew this was an opportunity to confront her past head-on. When the day finally arrived, Claire felt a mix of nerves and determination. She dressed simply but neatly, wanting to present herself as calm and composed. Alexander picked her up and drove her to the mediation office, his steady presence a source of comfort. The room was small and sterile, with a long table in the center. Mr. Douglas and Brandon sat on one side, their expressions a mix of irritation and discomfort. Claire took a seat across from them, with Alexander by her side. The mediator, a neutral third party, sat at the head of the table, outlining the ground rules for the discussion. As the meeting began, Mr. Douglas wasted no time trying to take control of the narrative. This entire situation has been blown out of proportion, he said, his tone clipped. My son made some mistakes, but he's young. He didn't mean for things to go this far. Claire clenched her fists under the table, her nails digging into her palms. Alexander placed a hand on her arm, grounding her. With all due respect, Mr. Douglas, Alexander said calmly, this isn't just about mistakes. Your son's actions had serious consequences for Claire. She lost her job, her home, and her sense of security because of his lies. Brandon scoffed, leaning back in his chair. Oh, please. She's just looking for a payout. That's why you're here, isn't it, Claire? To cash in on some sob story? Claire's breath caught in her throat. For a moment, she considered staying silent, letting Alexander handle the response. But then she remembered why she was there, to reclaim her voice. "I'm here because you ruined my life," she said, her voice steady despite the anger bubbling beneath the surface. "You lied about me, humiliated me, and left me with nothing. This isn't about money, it's about accountability." Her words hung in the air, silencing the room. For the first time, Brandon looked genuinely uncomfortable, his smirk fading as he avoided her gaze. The discussion continued for hours, with both sides presenting their arguments. Mr. Douglas offered a settlement, a sum of money meant to compensate Claire for her losses. It was a tempting offer, but Claire hesitated. Accepting the settlement would mean letting them off the hook without any real acknowledgement of their wrongdoing. "What do you want to do?" Alexander whispered, his voice low enough for only her to hear. Claire took a deep breath, her gaze fixed on Mr. Douglas and Brandon. "I want them to admit what they did," she said firmly. "I don't care about the money. I want the truth." Alexander nodded, his respect for her growing even more. He turned to the mediator. "Claire is willing to forego the settlement if Mr. Douglas and Brandon publicly admit to their actions and issue a formal apology." Brandon started to protest, but Mr. Douglas cut him off. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth. "We'll issue the apology." The meeting ended shortly after, and Claire walked out of the building feeling lighter than she had in months. She hadn't just stood up to Brandon and Mr. Douglas, she had refused to let them define her worth. For the first time, she felt like she was taking control of her own story. "You were incredible in there," Alexander said as they walked to his car. "That kind of strength, it's rare." Claire smiled, a genuine warmth spreading through her chest. "I had a good mentor." A week later, the apology was published in the local paper. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. Claire read the words with a sense of closure, knowing that the people who had wronged her were finally being held accountable. But more importantly, she knew she had done something even greater, she had faced her past and emerged stronger. The road ahead was still uncertain, but she was ready to face it, one step at a time. Claire stood on the library's steps, a newspaper in her hand. The printed apology from Mr. Douglas and Brandon was bold on the front page. Though it wasn't as heartfelt as she might have hoped, the public acknowledgement of their lies was enough. The satisfaction came not just from the words, but from knowing she had fought for her truth, and won. Still, as the initial relief faded, Claire couldn't help but feel the weight of everything she had endured. Justice had been served, but it hadn't erased the pain of being cast out, humiliated, and left to fend for herself. Now, she had to decide how to move forward. Later that day, Claire received an unexpected visitor at the community center. Nancy, her foster mother, stood in the doorway, clutching a small bag and looking as uneasy as Claire had ever seen her. Claire froze, unsure of how to react. Memories of her last moments in Nancy's house flooded back, the cold dismissal, the door slamming shut behind her, and the feeling of complete abandonment. "Can we talk?" Nancy asked hesitantly, her voice softer than Claire remembered. Claire hesitated before nodding. She led Nancy to a quiet corner of the center and sat down across from her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Nancy looked at her hands, fumbling with the strap of her bag. "I saw the article," Nancy began, her voice wavering. "About what happened?" "I didn't know. I didn't realize." "You didn't want to realize," Claire interrupted, her tone sharper than she intended. "You didn't even give me a chance to explain." Nancy flinched, her shoulders sagging under the weight of Claire's words. "You're right," she admitted. "I didn't. And I was wrong. I should have listened to you. I should have believed you." Claire stared at her, searching for any trace of insincerity, but all she saw was guilt and regret. Part of her wanted to lash out, to tell Nancy how much she had hurt her. But another part of her, a quieter, stronger part, knew that holding on to that anger would only drag her down. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Claire said finally, her voice steady. "But I'm not going to carry this anger anymore. I've moved on, and I think you should too." Nancy nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small envelope, sliding it across the table to Claire. "This isn't much," she said. "But it's what I owe you. For the time you spent working and helping with the bills. It's yours." Claire opened the envelope and found a modest sum of cash. She considered refusing it, but something told her to accept it, not as a payment, but as a gesture of closure. She slipped the envelope into her bag and stood. "I hope you figure things out, Nancy," she said quietly. "Take care of yourself." Nancy nodded, wiping her eyes. "You too, Claire." As Nancy left, Claire felt an unexpected sense of relief. She hadn't forgiven Nancy entirely, but she had let go of the bitterness that had weighed her down for so long. It was a small step, but it felt like progress. That evening, Claire sat with Alexander in his office, reflecting on everything that had happened. The sun was setting, casting a warm orange glow over the city skyline. Alexander poured her a cup of tea and leaned back in his chair, his expression calm and thoughtful. "How do you feel?" he asked. Claire considered the question for a moment. "Lighter," she said finally. "Like I'm not carrying so much anymore." Alexander nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "That's a good place to be." Claire took a sip of her tea, the warmth spreading through her chest. "What about you?" she asked. "Why do you do all this? Helping people like me?" Alexander's gaze turned distant for a moment, as though he were looking back on a memory. "Because I've been where you are," he said quietly. "I know what it's like to feel lost, to think the world has turned its back on you. But someone helped me once, someone who didn't have to. And that changed everything." Claire listened, her respect for Alexander growing with each word. He wasn't just a powerful businessman, he was someone who truly understood what it meant to struggle and persevere. "Do you think I'll ever be able to help people like you do?" she asked. Alexander's smile widened. "I don't think you already are. You stood up for yourself and showed others that they can do the same. That's more powerful than you realize." Over the next few weeks, Claire focused on building her future. She continued attending workshops at the community center, refining her skills and exploring new opportunities. With Alexander's encouragement, she also started volunteering at the center, sharing her story with others who were struggling. One day, as she worked with a group of young women, she realized just how far she had come. They looked to her for guidance, hanging on her every word as she shared her experiences. In their eyes, she saw something she hadn't seen in herself for a long time: hope. The final step in Claire's journey came in the form of an unexpected opportunity. Alexander offered her a position at his company, a chance to learn, grow, and build a career. Claire hesitated at first, unsure if she was ready for such a big step, but Alexander's unwavering belief in her gave her the confidence to accept. On her first day, she stood in the lobby of Alexander's sleek office building, a mix of nerves and excitement coursing through her. She looked up at the towering glass structure, a symbol of how far she had come. As she stepped through the doors, she felt a sense of purpose she had never known before. This wasn't just the start of a job, it was the start of a new chapter in her life. One where she could finally leave the pain of the past behind and look toward a future filled with possibility. Claire adjusted her ID badge as she stepped into Alexander's office building, her heart beating faster with each step. It had been a whirlwind few months since their paths had crossed, and now she was beginning something she never thought possible: a real job, with opportunities to grow. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. The office was a hive of activity. Employees buzzed about, their voices low but purposeful. Floor-to-ceiling windows bathed the sleek, modern space in natural light, and the distant hum of the city below added to the sense of energy. Claire couldn't help but feel a pang of doubt as she approached the reception desk, but she pushed it aside. She belonged here, even if it didn't feel real just yet. The receptionist, a cheerful woman named Lila, greeted her with a warm smile. "You must be Claire. Alexander's told us all about you." "Welcome." "Thank you," Claire said, her voice steady but tinged with nervousness. Lila handed her a folder. Here's everything you'll need to get started: your schedule, office map, and some general guidelines. If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask." Claire nodded, clutching the folder tightly as she made her way to the elevator. She had been assigned to a mentorship program within Alexander's company, where she would rotate through different departments, learning the ins and outs of the business. It was an opportunity she could only have dreamed of just months ago. Her first week was a blur of introductions, training sessions, and tasks that pushed her out of her comfort zone. Each day brought new challenges, but Claire tackled them with determination, eager to prove herself. Her colleagues were welcoming and supportive, and Alexander made it a point to check in with her regularly, offering guidance and encouragement. One afternoon, as she worked on a project in the marketing department, her supervisor, Elena, stopped by her desk. "You're doing great work, Claire," Elena said, setting a cup of coffee on her desk. "I can tell you're putting a lot of thought into this campaign." "Thank you," Claire replied, her cheeks flushing with pride. "I've never done anything like this before, but I'm learning a lot." Elena smiled. "That's the attitude that will take you far. Keep it up." Outside of work, Claire continued to stay involved with the community center. She spent her weekends volunteering, sharing her story with others who were struggling to find their footing. It became a source of fulfillment for her, a reminder of how far she had come and how much further she could go. One Saturday, as she helped organize a job readiness workshop, a young girl named Mia approached her. Mia was about Claire's age when she had first been kicked out of her foster home, and her story hit close to home. "How did you do it?" Mia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "How did you get through it all?" Claire knelt down so she could look Mia in the eye. "It wasn't easy," she admitted. "There were times I wanted to give up. But I found people who believed in me, and I started to believe in myself. That's where it all begins, with the decision to keep going, no matter how hard it gets." Mia nodded, her eyes shining with newfound determination. "I want to be like you someday." Claire smiled, her chest swelling with pride. "You already are." As the weeks turned into months, Claire's confidence grew. She excelled in her rotations at Alexander's company, earning praise from her mentors and colleagues. She even began to reconnect with her passion for art, sketching in her free time and incorporating her creativity into her work. Alexander watched her progress with quiet satisfaction. She had transformed from a girl weighed down by her past into a young woman full of potential and purpose. He knew she still had challenges ahead, but he also knew she had the strength to face them. One evening, as Claire sat in her small apartment, a space she had been able to afford thanks to her new job, she reflected on everything that had brought her to this point. The journey hadn't been easy, and there were still moments of doubt and fear, but she had learned to trust herself and the people who supported her. She picked up her notebook, the one she had carried with her through all the hardships, and began to sketch. The lines flowed effortlessly, forming an image of a tree growing strong and tall, its roots deep and unshakable. It was a symbol of her journey, a reminder that even in the harshest storms, growth was possible. As she put down her pencil and looked at the drawing, she smiled. For the first time in a long time, she felt truly at peace. Her story was far from over, but she was ready for whatever came next. The crisp morning air carried the scent of blooming flowers as Claire walked through the park, her notebook tucked under her arm. This park had been a turning point in her life, the place where she had first met Alexander and unknowingly set her journey of transformation into motion. Today, it felt like the perfect place to close one chapter and open another. Under the shade of a large oak tree, a small crowd had gathered. Volunteers from the community center, Alexander's team, and a few friends she had made along the way were there to support her. Even Mia, the young girl she had mentored, stood near the front, beaming with pride. At the center of it all was a small sapling, its delicate branches swaying gently in the breeze. It was the tree Claire had chosen to plant as a symbol of growth, resilience, and the journey she had endured. The community center had helped arrange the event, calling it a celebration of new beginnings. As the crowd quieted, Alexander stepped forward to say a few words. His calm, confident voice carried over the group, commanding attention. Today, we're not just planting a tree, he began. We're celebrating the incredible strength and determination of a young woman who refused to let life's challenges define her. Claire's journey has inspired all of us, and this tree will stand as a reminder of what is possible when we refuse to give up. The crowd applauded, and Claire felt her cheeks flush with emotion. Alexander stepped aside and motioned for her to take the spotlight. She hesitated for a moment, overwhelmed by the significance of the moment, but then she stepped forward, gripping the shovel that had been left for her. Claire looked out at the faces before her, each one filled with encouragement and pride. For so long, she had felt invisible, just a nameless, voiceless girl trying to survive. But now, she stood tall, her voice strong and clear. When I first came to this park months ago, I felt lost, she began, her words carrying the weight of her journey. I didn't know where I was going or how I was going to make it. But one act of kindness changed everything. It showed me that even in the darkest moments, there's always hope. She paused, taking a steadying breath. This tree represents more than just my journey. It's for anyone who has ever felt alone, forgotten, or defeated. It's a reminder that no matter where you start, you can grow into something strong and beautiful. With those final words, Claire planted the sapling, pressing the soil firmly around its base. The crowd erupted into applause, and Claire stepped back, her heart swelling with pride and gratitude. The sapling stood resilient and full of potential, just like her. After the ceremony, the crowd lingered to congratulate Claire and share in her accomplishment. Mia ran up to her, her eyes shining with excitement. "Claire, that was amazing," Mia said. "Someday, I'm going to do something like this too." "You will," Claire replied, kneeling down to meet Mia's gaze. "And I'll be here to cheer you on." Nearby, Alexander watched the exchange with a quiet smile. He approached Claire as the crowd began to disperse, his hands in his pockets. "You did good, Claire," he said simply. Claire looked at him, her gratitude shining through. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." Alexander shook his head. "You had it in you all along. I just gave you a little push." As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting the park in golden light, Claire lingered near the sapling. She traced the leaves with her fingers, feeling the strength in its tiny branches. It was small now, but she knew it would grow tall and strong, just as she had. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt truly grounded. Her past no longer held her captive, and her future stretched before her like an open road. The challenges she had faced had shaped her, but they didn't define her. She had found her voice, her purpose, and a community that believed in her. Years later, the sapling grew into a towering tree, its branches providing shade for countless visitors to the park. It stood as a testament to Claire's journey, a reminder of how far she had come. And though Claire's life continued to evolve, her career thriving, her role as a mentor expanding, she never forgot the roots of her story. Every year, she returned to the park to visit the tree, often bringing the young people she mentored to share its story. To them, it was more than just a tree. It was proof that even the smallest beginnings could lead to something extraordinary. Claire's journey was far from over, but she faced it with the confidence of someone who had weathered the storm and come out stronger. She was no longer the lost, frightened girl she once was. She was Claire, a woman who had found her strength, her voice, and her place in the world. And as she stood beneath the tree's sprawling branches, she knew one thing for certain: the best was yet to come.